Well, here we are in the middle of a coronavirus lockdown at the heart of the Christian year, and the gospel story is another lockdown. All the disciples, well, almost all of them were in Jerusalem, and knowing that Jesus had risen from the dead, were they elated? Were they out spreading the good news? No, they were scared and were together in a room, and following current government advice, they had responded by realizing that the best protection from the current threat is your front door. And they had responded by shutting it and locking it from the inside. Locking it tight for fear? Yes. For fear of a virus? No. For fear of the Jews. Now that's quite a strange fear to have in one sense, because all of the disciples were themselves Jews. Probably this refers to Jewish authorities or local mobs, although our present lockdown leads us, and many of us, to fear ourselves as well. If you go out, and you're not encouraged to, but if you go out and anyone sneezes or coughs, then they are glared at and they're shunned for fear they may have the virus. Here in Manton, our walking is restricted as the Rutland water paths are closed for fear of spreading the virus. Fear was as real then as it is now, but for very different reasons. The disciples had seen what had happened to Jesus and were afraid that the Jews, as John puts it, would come after them, and a similar fate would befall them as well. And actually, we know they were right to be afraid if you read the accounts of what happened to many of the disciples after the resurrection and Pentecost. People are right to take precautions now for fear of catching or spreading this deadly virus. And sadly, the daily statistics show all too clearly the importance of taking precautions, staying at home to save lives. And in the midst of all this fear, the risen Jesus appears. And were the disciples elated then? Were they encouraged then? Well, I would be surprised if they were at first. How did you get here? What are you? Who are you? Those might all be perfectly reasonable questions that the disciples might ask this presence who has suddenly appeared in their room behind a locked door. And we get a clue that that might well have been the case, because after saying, "Peace be with you," Jesus then shows them his hands and his side. They can put their hands in the spaces where the nails were and their hand in the side where the spear went. And there's no criticism in verse 20 of them doing this. There will be criticism that's going to come shortly. But for now, as Jesus enters this locked room, he faces and answers their doubts and shows them the evidence that they need. And Jesus gives the disciples authority to forgive sins in the power of the Holy Spirit, which the disciples received there and then. Now, some people question this and say, surely the Holy Spirit came at Pentecost, and that's 50 days later. That's why it's called Pentecost, 50 days. This must be wrong. Well, no, it's not wrong. You see, the Holy Spirit's always been there. It's part of the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Part of the Godhead. And the Hebrew name for the Holy Spirit is ruach, which means wind or breath. So it's always been there, but Pentecost brought a special outpouring of the Holy Spirit in a very dramatic way. So the disciples who have seen and touched the evidence of Christ's resurrection are keen to share this evidence with others, and particularly others, disciples who weren't there, and therefore particularly Thomas. So when they meet Thomas, they tell him. And they tell him what happened and the evidence that they have. And this is the difference. This is why Thomas is to this day known as Doubting Thomas. You see, the fault with Thomas lies in the shortest word he uses, at least in our language, the word I. Unless I see the mark of the nails in his hands and put my finger in the mark of the nails and my hand in his side, I will not believe. Regardless of the testimony and the evidence of his fellow disciples who he should trust, Thomas does not believe and doubts. And so a week later, when he meets Jesus, he puts his fingers in the nail holes and his hand in the side, and his response is, "My Lord and my God." And Thomas is chided and told, "Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have come to believe." Thomas had all the evidence he should have needed. Eyewitness accounts from people he trusted. This is important because in John's Gospel, there is nothing in John's Gospel that is not there for a purpose. John chooses 3 resurrection appearances different from the other Gospels because he wants to get 3 points across. In this case, he wants to get across fear and doubt. That's why this passage is here. And we have our doubts too. And we demand evidence. Evidence for doubts as to whether or not this pandemic will ever end, when it will end, and what the consequences of it all will be. Will life be the same again ever? Where is God in all this? And what are and where are the faith handles that we can cling to in this time? If God is active now, why is this person or that person not being healed and not being protected? Now, I want to suggest that this lockdown is a very good time for all of us to start addressing some of these big questions, to get to grips with the faith handles that we need in times just like this, to get on and read and study and pray and listen, so that we may be rooted, as Paul says, and grounded in love. It is at times like this we need those faith handles to encourage us and sustain us. And books like the Gospel of John provide just such an opportunity. The problem for us as Christians is that it seems there are so many different areas of doubt in the Christian faith that we can find. Even the resurrection itself is a problem for many people. I'm often reminded, reading this passage, of a great book that was written by Frank Morrison 90 years ago called Who Moved the Stone? He wrote it in 1930. It remains in print today, and I commend it to you. He set out to write a book discrediting the resurrection of Jesus. And he called the book Who Moved the Stone? But as he researched the evidence, his mind changed, and he concluded, without doubt in his mind, that Christ did indeed rise from the dead. And so in an embarrassing call to his publishers, Faber and Faber, he explains to them that the book would not be quite as they had expected. The by now relieved publishers at the time responded with a simple question. Well, that's great, Frank. What's the title of the book to be now? Oh no, said Frank Morrison. The title of the book remains the same. Who moved the stone? You see, Frank Morrison had to work through his doubts. And because he worked through his doubts, he found faith. The disciples had to work through their doubts. And because they did that, in the presence of Jesus, they found faith. Finally, armed with all those faith handles, all that evidence, what will we do about it? Jesus is very clear to his disciples in lockdown, and he says in verse 20, as the Father has sent me, so I send you. And according to tradition, we do believe that Thomas got that. And Thomas went out, as many of the disciples did, to be a missionary, but he went east and he travelled to India, where he formed a church in Chennai, which was formerly Madras, and was martyred as a Christian in Madras. As the Father sent me, so I send you. What does that mean for each of us in lockdown? The only way we can answer that question is to look at what it meant for Jesus. Jesus came into the world as a poor person. He came as a servant. He emptied himself. He delighted to do the Father's will. He identified himself with humanity. He went about doing good. He did everything by the power of the Holy Spirit, and his goal was the cross. So there we have it. And Jesus said to his disciples, and he says to us, as the Father has sent me, so now I send you. He said that to disciples, followers of Jesus in lockdown. And we too are in lockdown. So I guess we had better get ourselves ready, hadn't we? Amen.